A woman called our house asking to speak with her husband, and I told her, politely but firmly, that she must have the wrong number because my husband and I had been married for 6 years. She said his full name, his birth date, and the city where they'd married 9 years earlier. She wasn't confused. She was still, legally, his wife, because the divorce he'd told me was finalized before we ever met had never actually been completed, and I had spent 6 years unknowingly married to a man who was still legally married to someone else. My name is Jennifer, and this is the story of how I discovered, through a single, disorienting phone call, that my entire marriage had been legally invalid from the very beginning, not through any deliberate deception my husband constructed for me specifically, but through his own failure to address a legal loose end from his previous marriage that he apparently believed, for reasons I'm still working to fully understand, had simply resolved itself. I want to explain what my marriage to Marcus looked like before this discovery, because I think understanding the genuine, functional stability of what I believed was a legally solid partnership matters to understanding just how devastating this revelation ultimately became. Marcus and I met roughly 7 years ago, both of us in our early 30s, married after a year and a half of dating. He had mentioned, early in our relationship, that he'd been previously married for about 4 years, a marriage that had ended in what he described as an amicable divorce roughly 2 years before we met. I remember, specifically, one of our earliest serious conversations about his previous marriage, sitting on my apartment balcony several months into dating. Marcus explaining that he and Karen had simply grown apart over the years, that there was no dramatic betrayal or conflict, just two people who'd realized they wanted different things from life. I remember appreciating his openness about this history, feeling like it represented a genuinely mature, honest foundation for our own developing relationship, never once imagining that the specific detail about the divorce being finalized wasn't actually accurate. I want to be direct about something that, in hindsight, represented the specific point where this entire situation began, though I had no reason at the time to recognize any concern. Marcus told me, when I asked about his previous marriage during our early dating period, that the divorce had been finalized before we met, a statement I had no reason to doubt, understanding it as a simple, straightforward fact about his relationship history rather than something requiring independent verification. I want to describe our own wedding, which took place roughly a year and a half after we began dating. A genuinely joyful, meaningful ceremony that I'd always considered, right up until this devastating discovery, one of the most significant days of my entire life. We obtained our marriage license through entirely standard, legitimate channels, and I had no reason whatsoever to question the legal validity of what followed, understanding our marriage to be exactly as legally solid as any other couple's, built on Marcus's own understanding that his previous marriage had already been properly, legally dissolved. I want to describe the phone call that eventually revealed the actual, devastating truth, because the specific circumstances of how this information reached me matter considerably to understanding just how accidentally this entire situation finally came to light. I received a call on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, roughly 6 years into our marriage, from a woman who identified herself as Karen, explaining she was trying to reach Marcus regarding what she described as some paperwork we still need to sort out. I want to describe the specific, growing confusion of this conversation, initially assuming Karen represented some work colleague or acquaintance I simply didn't recognize, until she clarified, with what I understand now was her own genuine confusion about my role in Marcus's life, that she was his wife. I think there's been some kind of mistake, I told her, my voice carrying the mild, unbothered confusion of someone assuming a simple identification error rather than the beginning of a genuine crisis. Marcus and I have been married for 6 years. Karen's response, delivered with what I understand now was her own growing, parallel confusion and alarm, revealed information that fundamentally upended my entire understanding of my own marriage. That's not possible, she said. Marcus and I are still legally married. Our divorce was never actually finalized. I've been trying to reach him for months about finishing the paperwork, but he's been avoiding my calls. I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of hearing this information, standing in my kitchen, trying to reconcile 6 years of what I believed was a legally solid marriage against this stranger's calm, confident assertion that she remained Marcus's actual legal wife. I called Marcus immediately after hanging up with Karen, my hands shaking as I dialed a number I called countless times throughout our relationship, needing some form of explanation that would resolve what felt, in that moment, like an impossible, devastating misunderstanding. Marcus, I just got off the phone with someone named Karen, who says she's still legally married to you. What is she talking about? The silence on his end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely understood, before he said anything substantive, that whatever explanation followed wouldn't be the reassuring correction I desperately needed to hear. "I need to explain this in person," he said, his voice carrying a strange, defeated quality. "This is more complicated than I think I ever properly dealt with." I want to describe the following devastating conversation. Once Marcus arrived home, slowly, haltingly revealing a truth he had apparently been avoiding confronting directly for the better part of a decade. He explained that his divorce from Karen had, in fact, been formally initiated roughly 9 years earlier, with both of them agreeing to the separation and beginning the legal process through an attorney Karen had retained. According to Marcus's account, the actual divorce proceedings had stalled partway through, due to what he described as some complicated disagreements regarding division of a small business they'd jointly owned during their marriage, disagreements that had apparently never been fully resolved, leaving the divorce technically incomplete despite both of them having moved on with their separate lives, believing, in some vague, unexamined way, that the marriage had essentially ended even without the formal legal conclusion actually being finalized. "I genuinely thought it was done," Marcus told me, during this devastating conversation. "We stopped talking, we both moved to different cities. I assumed at some point the paperwork had just gone through without me needing to actively follow up on it. I know that sounds impossible to believe now, but I never actually confirmed it. I just assumed enough time had passed that it must have been finalized." I want to try to describe the specific, layered devastation of this explanation, understanding that Marcus hadn't necessarily engaged in some deliberate, calculated deception specifically targeting me, but had instead demonstrated a genuinely staggering, sustained negligence regarding one of the most significant legal matters of his own life, a negligence that had ultimately, devastatingly, invalidated our own marriage without either of us having any awareness this was the actual legal reality. Throughout our entire 6 years together, I want to describe the following weeks, an exhausting, disorienting process of consulting with a family law attorney to understand exactly what our actual legal status had been throughout our marriage and what steps would be necessary to resolve this situation going forward. My attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Fenwick, confirmed the devastating reality I'd already begun to understand. Because Marcus's first marriage to Karen had never been legally dissolved, our own marriage ceremony, however genuine and meaningful it had felt to both of us, had never actually been legally valid. In the eyes of the law, I had never actually been married to Marcus at all. I want to describe the specific, overwhelming practical complexity this revelation introduced into our lives, considerably compounded by the fact that Marcus's actual, ongoing legal marriage to Karen meant this situation couldn't simply be resolved through the kind of straightforward, confirmation marriage process I'd later learn other couples in somewhat similar situations, involving simple administrative filing errors, had been able to pursue. Marcus first needed to actually, formally complete his divorce from Karen before any question of legally marrying me could even become possible. I want to describe the specific, difficult months that followed, watching Marcus finally, actively work to resolve the 9-year-old unfinished divorce proceedings with Karen, a process complicated by the considerable time that had passed and the genuine, remaining business ownership disputes that had originally caused the proceedings to stall in the first place. I want to be honest about my own complicated, evolving feelings throughout this period, understanding that I was essentially waiting for my partner of 6 years to finalize a divorce from a woman he'd been legally married to throughout our entire relationship, a situation that, however unintentional its origins, introduced a genuinely disorienting, uncomfortable dynamic into what I had always believed was simply my own solid, uncomplicated marriage. I want to describe the specific, difficult questions this situation raised regarding our own shared life throughout the preceding 6 years. Our jointly purchased home, held under an assumption of legal marriage that had never actually existed, our combined finances and retirement account beneficiary designations, all built upon a foundation that, legally, had simply never existed in the way either of us had believed. I want to describe working with Ms. Fenwick to understand our actual legal protections during this uncertain period, learning, with some relief, that various legal doctrines existed specifically to protect parties who had genuinely, reasonably believed themselves to be legally married despite an underlying defect like this, providing some continuity of legal protection regarding property division and other matters, even while the core marital status question remained unresolved pending Marcus's actual divorce finalization. Marcus's divorce from Karen ultimately took just over 5 months to fully finalize. Once he began actively, seriously engaging with the process rather than the passive assumption he'd apparently maintained for the preceding 9 years. I want to describe the specific, complicated relief I felt once this process concluded, understanding that we could finally, actually pursue our own legal marriage. though the experience had introduced a lasting complexity into my understanding of our relationship that a simple legal resolution couldn't fully erase. I want to describe our own confirmation wedding, which took place roughly 6 weeks after Marcus's divorce from Karen finally, formally concluded, a considerably smaller, more subdued ceremony than our original wedding 6 years earlier, one carrying a specific, complicated emotional weight given everything we'd navigated to arrive at this actual, legally valid moment. I want to describe the specific, ongoing difficulty of processing this particular experience, understanding that unlike some forms of deliberate deception, Marcus's underlying failure appeared to represent genuine, if genuinely difficult to fully comprehend, negligence rather than calculated dishonesty specifically targeting me. This distinction, while providing some context, didn't fully resolve the lasting impact this discovery had on my sense of security within our relationship, introducing a specific, persistent question about what other significant matters Marcus might handle with similarly concerning passivity or avoidance. I want to describe the extensive couples therapy Marcus and I engaged in throughout this period, specifically addressing both the practical crisis and the deeper question of what this revelation indicated about his broader approach to significant responsibilities and difficult conversations. A pattern our therapist helped us identify as extending somewhat beyond just this specific marital situation into other areas of Marcus's life where he'd historically demonstrated a tendency to avoid actively confronting uncomfortable, unresolved matters. I want to be honest that our relationship, in the time since this entire situation resolved, has required genuinely significant, ongoing work to rebuild the kind of confident security I'd always previously felt regarding our marriage's fundamental stability. I don't think this specific kind of trust fully returns quickly or automatically, even once the underlying legal issue itself has been formally resolved. It's been just over 14 months since that initial, disorienting phone call from Karen first revealed this devastating truth. Marcus and I remain married, now unambiguously, legally, following our confirmation ceremony, though I continue working, alongside our ongoing couples therapy, to process the lasting impact of learning that 6 years of my adult life had actually existed within a legal reality considerably different from what I'd always confidently believed. I think, often, about the specific, strange nature of this particular situation, understanding that unlike stories involving deliberate, calculated deception, our circumstances emerged from a genuinely human, if genuinely consequential, pattern of avoidance and unexamined assumption, one that nonetheless devastatingly affected 6 years of my own life without my knowledge or any opportunity to address it sooner. If you've ever discovered that a significant assumption underlying your most important relationship rested on someone else's unaddressed negligence rather than deliberate deception, I want to hear how you navigated both the practical resolution process and the deeper question of trust this kind of discovery inevitably raises regarding a partner's broader pattern of handling significant, uncomfortable responsibilities. I used to believe that a partner's simple, confident assertion about their own significant life history, particularly something as seemingly straightforward as confirming a previous divorce had been completed, represented sufficient basis for trust without requiring independent verification. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that even genuine, well-intentioned partners can carry significant unaddressed loose ends from their own past, and that sometimes the foundation we've built our entire shared life upon deserves more active confirmation than most of us ever think to seek.